Well, hello everyone. Jason Tripp here with some new friends and authors, Laura and Karl Forehand, co-authors of a new book releasing mid-August. I believe it's August 15th. Is that correct?
That's right.
Called Out into the Desert, Thriving Outside Organized Religion. And so I want to thank you, Laura and Karl. First of all, thank you for this book. This book was a gift to my wife and I appreciate you reaching out and agreeing to set up this conversation. And I know this book will be a gift to many others because it's coming from the deep places in your story. Thank you for your vulnerability and for your honesty. And it's just really sharing your story, Karl, in vocational ministry for many years, and then being stirred to wander out into what you call the desert, where you are finding some peace now. Before we get into the book, I pulled something off my shelf here. I didn't prep you on this, but I'm a bit of a board game junkie, and I got this game. It's called Forbidden Desert. Thirst for Survival, and my kids and I, we like this game. It's not a competitive game, it's a cooperative game. So you're in this desert and you're playing together, and you're either you all survive together or none of you survive. And I thought of this game as I was reading your book, because you wrote this book not individually, but you wrote it together. It was a cooperative project, and I think the book is better because of it. And so I guess first question I just want to ask you, what was the genesis of this book? Rather than kind of you sharing your whole story right out of the gate, maybe just talk to us about where you were in your life, in your journey, in your ministry. When did you look at each other and say, we're going to write this book together? It didn't happen overnight. I'm sure it's a journey, it's a process, but maybe you can just give us the long and short of it.
Yes, we were pastors of a church for 20 years. And I say I was, because she wasn't allowed in our denomination. But we were pastors and once we began deconstructing, then that kind of led us outside the church. But we came across a person called Cindy Wong Brandt. She authored a book called Parenting Forward, and she was on our podcast as we would talk about deconstruction things. And she challenged us to take a gap year off of church. And we had actually already began that a little while before that. And so she said, if you can't take a year off of church, why can't you? And kind of challenged us with that. And so that was kind of the beginning of it. And then once we were a year or so into it, we really started thinking about, we really don't want to go back. It's like we've been on a vacation for a year or so, and we don't want to go back. Well, is there something to that? Is there a reason why we don't want to go back? And we started trying to think about the reasons why we should or why we shouldn't. It was just kind of an analysis of are we supposed to go? Do we have to? Does it make any sense in the 21st century? And all those kind of questions, we just kind of wrestled around with them. And then oddly enough, we started sharing stories, just kind of, and Laura kind of came at the end of this, not totally excited about it, I would say, but as she began to write, we began to tell our stories, and we just cried a lot, and began to kind of put pieces together. And as we did that, then eventually we got to the last part of the book, where after we had shared our stories and kind of done our analysis, I wouldn't call it in-depth research or anything like that, but just how do we feel about church? How do we feel about organized religion? And so then the last part became, how do we thrive out here, or how are we thriving now, even just after a year? Now it's been 3 years. So we wrote the book together in two or 3 weeks, and she says her part took a little longer.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm not, Karl's more of a natural writer. I like to write, but I have to be, I don't know, I like to say inspired. I might journal or something like that. But this was a really good opportunity for me to begin maybe the whole healing process. And I didn't really realize that that's what it was going to do, but it actually allowed me to, because when I speak, I'm speaking of my own lived experience. So I don't want that to sound like everybody who leaves organized religion feels this way or goes through this. But for me, it was just a chance to really ask myself those questions, like, who am I? What do I believe? All my life, I'd been going to church and really was told, this is who God is. This is what you believe. These are the creeds we say. So what my beliefs were everybody else's beliefs for me, if that makes any sense. So that was probably the biggest part for me in writing this book, was just asking myself those hard questions and beginning the whole healing process.
Yeah, and that you answered my very next question. I was curious how this whole journey of writing this book served as therapeutic for you individually and as a couple. I imagine as you were writing, you're putting your finger on things that you knew you wanted to write about, but there were probably some deeper places that the writing process sort of uncovered and allowed you to find some healing from. Is that a correct assumption? Or?
Yeah, I would say so. Definitely for me. In fact, it's funny, as we went back, because we wrote this, two years ago. And when we went back recently and reread it, I was sure that I was extremely angry when I wrote this, my sections of the book. And come to find out, I mean, as I was going back and reading it, I didn't feel anger. So even if I was writing it from a place of anger, I feel like those places are starting to soften and starting to heal. So, I think that will continue. I don't see this as a journey like, okay, here I am, I've arrived. I just think this is a lifelong journey of discovery for me personally. And I've learned to be okay with that. I was huge into certainty within the church. And so that was a huge hurdle for me to tackle when we first decided not to go back to church. So I'm happy that I'm in this place now of reflection and realizing that I really hope that I don't ever come to a destination, but I continue to evolve and to grow and to question and to learn. Yeah. So it's a continuing process for sure.
Yeah, certainty is a huge, subtle, but such a nefarious idol in the church, isn't it? Like, we have some mutual friends. Keith Giles' new book is on certainty and mystery. Matt DiStefano's book as well. I mean, there's a lot of voices, and you devote a whole chapter to certainty in your book, I believe, and it's there all over the pages. So the book, I want to get into the content a little bit, and we can sort of weave through a bit of your story as we go through some of the content. But you've layered the book into two parts, and I think that was a really wise choice. That really worked well for my wife and I as we were going through it. And the first part, I'm just going to read the chapters out if I can, just to give people a feel for what's in the book. So the first part is some observations about the church. And that's basically, you're just being honest. And each of you, I love how the chapter, Karl, you'll bring your voice on the topic of the one chapter, and then Laura, you'll give your voice. And my wife and I really love that. We would listen to a chapter and then we'd talk about it, because I'm a pastor and she's a pastor's wife, and so we talk about it from our experiences. What could we relate to? What was foreign to us? And so it was great for us. And I really appreciated hearing both your writing styles and both your voice. I think this book would have been very good had one of you written it. I think it's much better because both your voices are in it. So I really appreciate that. I want to let you know, and I'm sure other couples and families it'll lead to more, not only processing it individually, but I hope, and I'm sure your hope is that people will discuss this as couples, as families in their small groups or whatever. Right. So the first part, here are some of the chapter titles. There's 10 chapters in the first part. Some of your observations. Chapter 1, the main thing. And then addicted to church. I want to circle back to that shortly. Chapter 3, the services of the church. Then you have a chapter on the cost of doing business. We can do better. One of my favorite chapters, chapter 5. Chapter 6, would Jesus go to church? And I loved your kind of conflicting answers on that one. I appreciated the different perspectives you're bringing to that. Chapter 7, the things that hurt. Chapter 8, how religion ruined my sex life. Well, it hasn't ruined mine yet. So, Chapter 9, the role of women. I'm in a denomination, thankfully, where we have women in leadership in all roles, from the bishop on down. So, but I did grow up at a young age in a conservative Baptist church, so I saw a little glimpse of the men doing all the heavy lifting in the church. And then chapter 10, the need for control. Did you intentionally put that as the final chapter in the first part? I'm a firm believer that control is kind of the root of everything else. I don't want to be too minimalistic, but I think a lot of things stem from that. Did you guys want to kind of land the plane there in the first part?
No, not necessarily. I don't think there was anything intentional about the organization of the first part of the book, but certainly fear and control are, it's something that as a pastor, when you went to seminary or did your training, you never thought about fear and control.
Yeah.
But, Kristen DeMay's book, it's out, Jesus and John Wayne, talks about that fear factor and how central it is to everything. Almost everything we did was in response to someone's fear. And then we needed to control it. So it's never something you intend to do. But something in you kind of subtly realizes if my sermon starts to invoke a little fear, it has a lot more salesmanship to it. And we don't ever intend to do that, but it seems like it's at the root of almost everything, like you said.
Yeah, and I saw the fingerprints of that all over the first part of the book. So every chapter sort of alluded to that. And then chapter 10, there it is, the need for control. And then you pivot in part 2 of the book, and it goes from some of the observations and the honest critique from your experiences to finding your way in the desert. Before I read these chapter titles, let's talk a little bit about the title of the book, Out into the Desert, Thriving Outside Organized Religion. So let's just make sure we got our listeners are on the same page with your definition. So how do you define organized religion? And why was the desert imagery so central to the book? How and why did you grab onto the desert imagery for the title and the motif of the book?
Book part.
So we always say at the beginning of our podcast and at the beginning of this book, we always say, when you start asking questions, when you start questioning your faith, when you start pulling at the strings of the sweater, and it starts to come unraveled, it feels like, to us, it always just felt like we were walking out into the desert. We were wandering there. And it felt like we were on a journey. We had been told that the desert's okay, that it's vast and beautiful. And there's, and I think another contributing factor to that was the desert fathers and mothers.
Right.
One time during the church, they did that. They just kind of took up residence away from everything else. And we felt that was really important. Before you mentioned healing. And one of our big things that we talk about is that something Sarah Bessie, a Canadian, said. She said, the church doesn't have room for our grief. And, people wander into church with trauma and trouble, and the church wants to help them. The church promises to help them, but because it's an organization, it sometimes runs out of time and doesn't have enough energy or time to heal them. Once we got out into the desert, we almost immediately started healing because there were so few distractions now. And we just had to face them. We had to face that shadow, all of that stuff that we had pushed down for 20 years. It's kind of like a beach ball that surfaced from the water. We were trying to hold it underwater, and it surfaced for me. In the Being book that we wrote a couple of books back, I talked about that in detail, about facing that trauma. But when we, but anyway, so the desert just felt like, coming outside of religion. Religion gets organized after you get about 10 people in a group. You can have church at home, but then when there's a certain amount of people, it just all of a sudden kind of needs some organization, and it takes a lot of energy and time to keep that together. So but like I said, after about a year, we noticed we didn't want to go back. Well, was that because we were thriving, or was it because we're just faking ourselves out or something? And so that's kind of the subtitle, thriving. And we couldn't really put that title on it until we got done with the book and really evaluated, are we really thriving or not? And we kind of took a fresh look at the Beatitudes as to, what Jesus said was, how are you going to inherit? How are you going to prosper? What really matters? Anyway, so I don't know if I answered your question or not, but
No, absolutely. That's good. That's good. I wondered if there was a bit of a connection to the desert fathers and mothers there as well. I do want to talk a little bit about some of the practices that you've grabbed onto outside of organized religion, which sadly you had to get out of organized religion to discover, which is sad, because they should be a part of what's happening in the church. But I want to circle back to chapter 2, Addicted to Church, out of the gate. And I want to read a quote. I think this is definitely your voice, Karl. So after a sermon, church members, you write, have repeatedly thanked me for giving them their fix. They often say, I needed that, and complained of how that feeling most often didn't last past their first day back to work. And in that chapter, you talk about how religion can become an unhealthy addiction. A few years back, I preached a sermon called When Churches Become Crack Houses. And I basically said the same thing. I think I lost a couple members that day, but just wanted to be very blunt. And I really resonated a lot with what you say in this chapter. Can you just unpack that from your experiences in your ministry, how you saw, to quote Karl Marx, I think you have that quote too, that religion can become the opiate of the masses, and how you experienced that?
Yeah, I think, people say, I don't want to get outside of church. I don't want to do the evaluation you're doing because I love church. And I would say you love church because it's designed to make you love it. We take an extreme example like Hillsong. Hillsong is almost scientifically designed to make everything in you experience extreme emotion during that service. The sermon will do that. People got addicted to my sermons, not because I'm a great speaker, just because there's something there. So I think we dealt with a lot of like meth addicts and bikers and stuff like that. And we noticed a lot of them would quit an addiction like alcohol or drugs, but then they would become addicted to religious things and doing religious things because it made them feel good.
Yep.
So anything that alters your emotion can become an addiction. And in church sometimes has a kind of a codependency method to it, where we develop this thing and we call it family, we call it things like that, or body. But many times it's just kind of a codependency. We just make each other feel good.
Yep.
What I worry about that is when we just make each other feel good, and then there's no substance to it, there's no healing. There's no time spent in deep shadow work, or we don't get enough counseling, things like that. We just, get charged up and then we lose it on Monday. So we got to come back.
Get your fix the next week, right?
Yeah. And it creates a codependency. And we're tried real hard in the book, even if we had strong emotions about things, not to say that if you find yourself in organized religion right now, we're happy for you if you're happy and that you're being fulfilled and you're being healed and all those things. So we're not trying to talk anybody out of anything. But as you mentioned before, you encounter a lot of people that are hobbling from one place to the other, and they've been wounded, they've been hurt. And I don't want that to continue. I don't want to destroy church. But we gotta kind of stop the train for a while and say, let's stop long enough to figure out what's broken, because it's a systemic problem. It's like racism in the United States. Mm-hmm. It's a systemic deal. It's not it's all the way back to Constantine and the way we do church and all those things. It's a systemic problem, and it needs some significant thought and some significant time to be re-engineered. And thus, it's not just people that need deconstruction, it's the church that does. It needs to be deconstructed.
Yeah,
and
absolutely. Yeah, I think you mentioned Constantine. I think you mentioned the book Pagan Christianity, Frank Viola and Barna. Yeah, I remember reading that coming out of seminary, and it gave me a lot of pause right from the get-go. I'm like, what kind of church do I want to pastor? Do I want to pastor a church even? Right. So I'm glad I read that early on in my ministry. That sort of gave me pause to kind of be on guard against some of the things that have more pagan roots and some of that codependency that you speak of in the book. Because I think you're onto something when you talk about churches being codependent, and someone can get healed from an addiction, but if they just fall into another addiction, maybe a more subtle addiction, there's still some root stuff, some healing that needs to go on. Right. So I think you put your finger on that in the book. So in the second part of the book, you devote 10 more chapters, and I don't want to read these chapter titles because I'm sure there's probably two types of people that are listening to this podcast, this conversation. There'll be some like yourselves that have left an institutional church and organized religion, and maybe they're trying to find some community and find some peace in the desert. And there are those maybe like myself that are still a part of the church. I try and keep it as disorganized as possible personally. But they're hanging on. They're trying to do some redemptive work from within the institution. And, in the second part of the book, here's the chapters, just so people listening can get a little taste. Finding community in the desert. I want to talk a little bit about community, or communities, as you put it. Finding my voice in the desert, chapter 12. Finding the word in the desert. Finding new practices in the desert. Finding companionship in the desert. Finding uncertainty in the desert. Finding acceptance in the desert. Finding comfort in the desert. Finding inheritance in the desert. And finally, finding satisfaction in the desert. Mercy in the desert. Vision in the desert, and then finding peace in the desert. And as I'm listening to and reading, we were actually listening, we had our computer read the book to us while we were doing our work in our kitchen renovations. So we couldn't figure out how to change it from a male voice to a female voice halfway through every chapter. That would have been nice. So we went back and forth. So Karl, you were a female voice at times. Laura, you were a male voice at times. But we made it work. But again, my wife and I had some really great conversations about, are we finding this in our ministry right now, in our circles? And I guess in the book, and maybe Laura, I want to pose this question to you, because you, more than Karl, talk about your children, and children are an important part of the family, and sadly in pastoral families, children sometimes are the collateral damage all too often. And as much as you're comfortable, can you share a little bit about, you talk about motherhood, the greatest gift of motherhood, and some of the joys and pains of your children growing up in the church, trying to protect them from some of the trauma that you've endured. Can you share a little bit about that journey as a mother?
Yeah. First of all, let me just say that, like, when Karl came to me and said, I feel like I've been called into the ministry. I really I can't remember like being super elated or like really bummed out about it. I mean, I was just very kind of okay. But I remember saying several times that I'm not going to be the typical pastor's wife within our denomination. What that looked like is, they played the organ or the piano and they were in charge of the nursery or the women's ministry or, vacation Bible school, all the things. And I just kept telling him, like, I'm not going to be typical pastor's wife. And I always believed that our children were children, just because their father's a pastor doesn't mean they're not going to be kids. I mean, they were really good kids growing up, but they were kids. And I mean, they had their sibling, bicker fests and, they would, I'd have to shush them in church or, whatever. But I really felt like somehow I had protected them from the things that Karl and I were going through. But, as our kids got older and I was able to have some conversations, especially when we started our deconstruction and came out of organized religion, I had discussions with them. And I'll never forget our son said, because I asked all of them, like, do you think you'll ever go back to church or, where do you see church in your life? And our son answered me and said, I just don't know that I can ever go back. And I asked him why that was. And he said, because I saw the way they treated you and Dad. So here I thought I was shielding my children.
They're
but
very
they
perceptive.
saw so much of it.
Mm-hmm.
They saw so much of it. And, we tried to have our conversations behind closed doors, but, there comes a time and maybe it's just me, maybe it's women. I don't know. I'll speak for myself, but there comes a time when, I can no longer hide my grief and my pain of this ministry. So I'm sure they saw tears and I'm sure that was hard for them to understand that. But yeah, that I really was hoping that I had shielded them from that. They do not in any way blame either one of us for their upbringing in the church, but I am grateful that, like you said, they had the perception, they were able to see things from a healthier lens, I would say, because I feel like each one of them have their own spiritual relationship with the divine. And I think that's awesome because I feel like I'm still, grappling with that. So yeah, I would say probably that's been my biggest heartbreak when I think about it, is knowing that my children knew way more and experienced way more of our hurt feelings and our injuries from the church than I ever hoped that they would.
Yeah, and you articulated that very clearly and vulnerably in the book, and I appreciate you being so honest about that. We have two children, 14-year-old and 11-year-old, and we often have similar conversations, right? We check in with them often about how their experiences are going in the life of the church, and I think they're going to continue to perceive. I'm sure they are perceiving, seeing you thrive in the desert, right? They're going to see how you've pivoted, and that will give them that sense of hope and peace. And I think that's what the next generation needs to see. Right?
We also stood up to it, and that's part of the pain, and I think they saw us do that also. So that may have helped.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's wonderful, though, that you guys are checking in with your kids. I love that. And if I could go back and do things differently, I wish someone would have maybe said that to us, check in with your kids and see, I just think that's great. Whether somebody told you that or you just had the awareness to check in with them. I think that's wonderful.
Well, I grew up in a, conservative sort of fundamentalist household, loving household. And so some of the things that I grew up looking back at, celebrating the good things, but, the certainty, they're not allowed to ask questions or have doubts, right? I don't want my children to have that rigid environment in the house or the church, right? So giving them a chance to ask questions, to push back, to ask hard questions about the scripture, I think that's so important, right? And then they feel their faith is a little more engaged. I think that's what young generation in particular wants, what they need. They need a voice, right? And we don't always get it right. We're kind of stumbling into this as we go, but I just want to make sure that they have an authentic faith, and because the younger generation, they can smell BS a mile away, right? That's why they want nothing to do with it. So
that kind of reminds me of a conversation I had with our oldest daughter before she went to college, because I just felt like there was something between, like, there was just some tension between us. And I just remember asking her if everything was okay between us. And she said yes. And she goes, I'm just really afraid to talk to you about it. And that just, it killed me, because I just always thought, like, I thought we always had this very open dialogue. But I just said, okay. And she goes, well, I just don't believe the same, like in the same way about things that you do. And, so that was another kind of eye-opening that I hadn't, as you said, I hadn't really checked in. I'm glad I've had that sense that there was something kind of this wedge between us, because I feel like with each one of our children, we're close with them. And so I just felt this unsettling. So I just love the fact that you check in, and I think that's so important. And I just assumed that our kids were grabbing everything we were feeding them, and they weren't. And I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful that they are, like I said, coming into their own spirituality and what that means to them.
Right. That's good. Well, we don't always get it right, I'm sure, but we're stumbling forward. So another question I've been thinking about as I was reading the book, I encounter a lot of couples where, one person in the marriage is deconstructing, but the other isn't. And that can lead to a lot of stress and a lot of strain in the marriage. Now, in the book, obviously, you're both giving voice to your own journeys, and they kind of dovetail with each other. Can you just share a little bit about how going through this process together? I mean, obviously, it wasn't in lockstep. I mean, there's highs and lows and ups and downs in every marriage, but the fact that you're going through this together, maybe just some advice or some of your own personal story to maybe some people listening that they're in a similar situation you were or are in, or maybe even if they're in a marriage where one person's deconstructing and the other isn't, one wants to leave the church, the other wants to stay. What could you say to those individuals, and what could you share from your experiences going through this together? Oh, it's a big, broad question, but I'll throw it out there.
It's funny when you're asking questions, we're both like looking at each other like, I
Ready, set, go.
I can answer that. I would say that I probably started to emotionally detach from the church, I'm assuming way before Karl did. I was not happy going to church, did not want to go to church, kind of just went through the motions of going, because he was still pastoring at that time. And, but even after he finally was like, okay, I'm done, I can't do this anymore. We still continued to go to church. We went to a church about an hour south of our house, and it would be pretty quiet on the drive there. I mean, mainly because I was like very anxiety ridden, like I did not want to go. But part of my story is I never want to keep Karl from, doing what he wants to do in the ministry. But I have to check that, because I lose myself in that, then my voice isn't heard, and I don't get to say, that this really isn't doing it for me anymore. But anyway, so on the way there was quiet, but on the way back, we fought the whole way home, and it was bad. And then we both had to do just some really deep, I think, shadow work for us to realize that, We were both just very wounded, probably before church, but then the things that happened inside the church just really, for me, just fed on those wounds and reopened them, or didn't allow them to heal, or whatever. Just various things that had happened. So I would say that even now, we're not totally on the same page. I feel like Karl is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like he's just way more grounded, maybe, in, not that he's set, not that he's certain, but he just is.
We don't want to go back to certainty.
Right. Like, he's just you seem way more comfortable with
deluded myself
where you are. And I feel like I can't put a name to anything. I can't, I'm still not floundering out here. Because there's actually this sense of peace that I have, even though I don't know what I don't know, and I'm not sure about a lot of things. But I still have this sense of peace about me. So that's kind of the long way around to say we are both deconstructing, but I'm not sure that we're on the same page. However, I think the big thing is once we got through just the toxicity of going to church and arguing and all that other kind of stuff, we were able to, and doing some shadow work too, we were able to then start having some conversations and respecting where the other person was, even if it wasn't. And I think that's one of the hardest things for me when I talk to other people about my experience. I'm very, very careful who I talk to in my community about our experience, because a lot of people will say, well, that doesn't happen at our church. That's, but the thing that's important when someone is sharing their lived experience with you is to believe them, whether that is your experience or not. And I think we finally got to a place where we were like, I believe you. What you're feeling is valid. And I think that's what's helped us kind of come from, two separate paths to, walking alongside each other.
Sure.
I was going to say that Laura did, I think at some point she verbalized that and said, we're going to be at different places on this journey. Mm-hmm. And we realized that early. When I was doing some spiritual direction training with some Catholic sisters, of all people, that's weird from being a Southern Baptist and then doing that. But
love it.
They taught me so much about deep listening and about embodied spirituality and stuff like that. But I was listening to one of the sisters speak one day, and it's in my T-Shop book. She said, she just went up to the chalkboard and wrote on it, none of us is right. And then she just turned around and stared at us for a while. It was very impactful. I'll never forget it. But now Keith Giles and some people are coming out with books about mystery and embracing mystery and realizing that what we've always used it as an excuse, but what we've always said is God is beyond us. And when different people have said, when you think you understand God, then you're probably wrong. But yet we develop creeds and belief systems and dogmas where we're sure that we're right. There's 14,000 other denominations, but we're sure that we're right. And so on this journey of deconstruction, you have to take that same commitment to uncertainty and say, if I'm on a journey of discovery, then there's no reason to be dogmatic. We know dozens of pastors and pastors' wives that are out here in the desert. And one thing you could never get them to do, it's when people start saying, oh, okay, we agree on some things, and they'll start talking like, maybe we should kind of organize and, get a system
right?
here.
Yeah.
They start
control, power.
Head. Yeah. They start, if they weren't on a Zoom, they would be running or walking out the door trying to get away from you, because that's not what it's about. It's not about, I don't know if you want to call it agreement, or, that is a little bit of comfort to know that, hey, we're on the same page. But when we're not, and we're trying to act like we are, like Laura said, we're going to fight. Maybe not on the way to church, but on the way home. But when we can admit, hey, I'm just not in the same place that you are. We're on similar journeys, and we're going to go there together. But we're going to kind of veer off on different paths from time to time, and that's okay.
So what I'm hearing is, just if there's other couples going through something similar, what I'm hearing is empathy, validating the other person's story, trying to understand their vantage point, their perspective, even though it might be different from yours or a different place or pace. That I don't think we can overstate the importance of empathy for those going through. The sad part is, at least in my experience, people like yourselves, they just can't stay in the organized traditional church environment, and they're given the label of backsliders, right? When really they're not backsliding per se. They just can't take it anymore. The trauma, the wounds, the toxicity, it's for their own health and wellness that they're finding other community. And so as I'm reading the book, I'm thinking, you haven't left the church per se. You've left a toxic form of a gathering in a building, an event, and finding healthy community centered around the person and the way of Christ, with Catholic sisters and otherwise, right? So and I think that's important. And Keith Giles has done some good work on this too, understanding what the ecclesia is, right? What the church is and isn't. And I want to read another quote from your book, because I wrote something else down here. I forget which of you mentioned this, but for all the time we have spent in church, you write, we really should be doing better than we are. Maybe we spend too much time erecting the church building and coming to church when we should have spent time being the church. Is it safe to say that you are spending much more time being the church now, having abandoned going to church and buildings and budgets and butts and seats, all the stuff we feel pressured into in vocational ministry? Maybe you can just share about what being the church is looking like now in the desert. Let's just talk about maybe part 2 of the book.
Yeah.
So I think for me, being the church, and I think I allude to it in the book, the things that Jesus said when he got serious and said, this is what it's all about, they were real simple things, like love your neighbor, turn the other cheek, things like that.
That one's not simple sometimes, but yeah.
Yeah, they're not easy to do. I mean, most genuine things are hard to do, but they're real simple to understand.
Right.
And I think those things, all they know, you talked about backsliding or sliding down a slippery slope, that kind of thing. That's what people assume, like you said, that we do. But I watch these pastors and their wives and these people that were in leadership within churches, and they get out in the desert, they find some real healing, and they began to, like you said, be the church. I'm watching them live beautiful lives. They've gone inside, they've found their true self. They're living authentically is a big word, living authentically from that true self. They're learning to be present in their lives. Jesus was very authentic and present, and he lived that way, with that awareness, that whatever the word is for it. But those are the kind of things I'm talking about. Not a commitment to not idolizing a book, not idolizing a building, not idolizing our creeds and belief statements or a political party or anything, but just very simply loving your neighbor as yourself, and also learning to love yourself, learning to be who you always were and live authentically from that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, just in our particular denomination, there was a lot of us versus them. So we had it all right. They are the lost ones. And I feel like stepping outside of that and kind of shedding that denominational cloak, I think I've been able to love better and love who I want to love. Like, I don't have to say, well, this is a group that, we need to stay away from because they're sinful. I can love, I really feel like I have more of a ministry now than I did, because I am able to just love. There's no parameters on that. And then also kind of, what Karl was alluding to, just helping those that need help. Whether that is my neighbor next door or, whatever that looks like to me. And at any given moment, I just feel like I have more freedom. Again, it's not an us versus them anymore. It's just, we're this collective. We're all one body, really. And inside the church, in our particular denomination, that wasn't something that was very, I don't know what you would say. It just wasn't part of that denomination. I guess I will say that. But probably the biggest thing for me is that now I'm able to really sit and be present with people. So in their grief and in their trauma, I don't feel like I have to fix them with a scripture or with a Jesus-y saying of any sort. I can just sit there and just be present with them, and ask them what they need from me, rather than me just saying, here's what you need. Mm-hmm. So I think all those things, I've just felt so much more freedom to do in the desert than I ever did inside the building called the church.
Right. Yeah, we get duped into thinking the building or the event is the church, right? Like, I preached a sermon a few years ago. There's a couple old sermons coming to mind as I'm reading. I just call it "Don't Go to Church." That was the title of my sermon. Just the point being is, church is not a building. It's not an event. If how people define us as different than them is how we spend our Sunday mornings, we're so missing the mark. And so I love the fact you're stepping into these deep practices, and you're finding just the breadth of Christian community outside of your denomination. And I've been learning to just kind of read widely from different voices, different denominations, different ethnicities and genders. And there's just such a richness in the broadness and the breadth and the depth of the Christian community, broadly speaking, going back to the early desert fathers and mothers, right? So can you, Karl, a question for you. I know you're involved in a lot of online community. And I think obviously since the global pandemic, a lot of us have been forced into more online community. And I'm a believer in both, and we can have virtual community and flesh and blood community. We need both. But maybe for those that were listening that are looking for an oasis in the desert, or maybe something online, what are some of the online groups or maybe podcasts or things that have been sort of like an oasis in the desert for you, or both of you?
Yeah, I'll mention, help me out if I...
Okay, I'll help you.
So we have a community called the Desert Sanctuary. And so it has a Facebook group. We also do a podcast, and I have a blog on Pathos. So all those things kind of work together. And I post most times on my main wall. And we have a website called karlforehand.com, Karl with a K and forehand like in tennis. We like messy spirituality with Jason Elam.
Yes.
We like everything Keith Giles does, usually, including the Heretic Happy Hour.
Which won't be for everyone, but yeah, it's a little spicy. Yeah, and he's got a Square One group as well. Yeah.
There's one of our friends. So we have 3 co-hosts on our Desert Sanctuary. One of them is Jason Elam, who does the messy spirituality. The other one is Aaron Tomlinson, and Aaron Tomlinson and Kyle Butler both are real low tech. They don't have any websites, or Aaron has a lot of little lives he does, but he doesn't have a podcast or a website or anything like that. He was a big charismatic preacher, gave up a lot to deconstruct, and he's a counselor and so on. So we appreciate him for that. Kyle Butler is, like I say, he doesn't have a website or anything like that. But he's one of the, I don't know how to describe Kyle, except that he's figured this thing out about going inside. And he understands it better than anybody I know and can articulate it. So you find him on our podcast. And I would say just listen to everything you can that Kyle says. And he's a very humble guy. He and Derek Day, Derek's kind of the same way, doesn't necessarily have a podcast, does a lot of lives and things like that. But I have a new one. It's called Snarky Faith. It's a little negative towards evangelicals. It's real negative towards evangelicals, but he's out in North Carolina, I think. It's I mean, those will get you started, and those will lead to other people. Choir is our publisher, QUOIR.
Yep.
And they're 30 or 40 authors now. I mean, it's growing. It grew almost too fast, but they have a lot of different authors out there that help you.
Yeah, I've been hanging out with all the choir boys and girls this month. So
Yeah.
with Keith and December Rose was with me last
Right.
week, and then
December's
I got
new,
Matt,
yeah.
Michelle next week. So I
Yeah.
appreciate all your voices. So we'll put all that information in the show notes today, so people can seek you out in some of the podcasts and things that you're involved with or you've recommended. But a final question. I'd love to talk for hours, but I don't want to take up too much of your time today. But kind of a forward-thinking question. A lady that is dear to me, she was one of the keynote speakers for our denomination before she passed, Phyllis Tickle. You mentioned her in your book, and her famous quote in her book, The Great Emergence, where every 500 years approximately, the church has this giant rummage sale and turns over some things, gets rid of some things, massive shift. And I think we're in agreement that we're in that sort of shifting season right now. 500 years post Protestant Reformation, approximately. What do you sense is the rummage sale is and will look like in the North American church, and what are the radical shifts that need to take place in the life of the church so we can not do church or play church, but be church? Love to hear that from both of you.
Yeah. Okay. For me, I'll go first. Always the one have Laura have the final word, so we can end on a good note. But yeah, some people like Alexander Shia say it's not just a 500-year rummage sale, but it's a 2,000-year death and burial and resurrection, just like most major religions go through. So I don't know, and I'm not necessarily a prophet. So, but what I would say is, just like the printing press had a lot to do with 500 years ago, the internet has a lot to do with today. Mm-hmm. We have information at our fingertips, and it really kind of goes back to community. Our first chapter in the second half of the book is finding community in the desert. Yeah. And it's, the big question is, where do I find my community? You kind of asked that a minute ago. The thing is, we don't live in a town of 250 people where we have one church out in the country, and that's where we meet. That's where we get community. It's not like that anymore, right? You can fly across the world and we could come up to see you. And we met Jason Elam online. We went last summer to visit their family. That's part of my community now. But there's another part over here, and I get sermons and podcasts from different parts of the country and different parts of the world. That your community is in the future is going to be different than it is now, and maybe drastically different. But that doesn't mean it can't be better. And I hope the major part of this, like we've alluded to several times, is not about discipleship. It's not about the things we normally think about. The key part for us has got to be that people genuinely find healing. and that they find that the wounds are not just spiritually bypassed, but that they're genuinely addressed and healed. I think I hope that's a part of the future. Carl Jung was only 100 years ago, and we understand all that shadow stuff now. We're just beginning to understand it. My hope that the revolution of the church is the revolution of healing and finding genuine relief from our trauma and our wounds, and that we can get beyond, as Laura mentioned, this us and them thing between denominations and political parties and countries, and that we'll truly kind of find that unity maybe that Jesus was talking about, because I think when you find that healing, true healing and relief from trauma, that you begin to look at other people as one of us, as part of the collective. We're all in this together. None of us is right, and none of us is right in the sense we're all wounded, and we need to learn to work together. So I'm hopeful that that's sort of what it looks like.
Yeah, for me.
Before I give Laura the last word,
yeah,
just you used a phrase a few times this afternoon, and I understand the phrase, but maybe some people don't. So maybe you can quickly unpack, what do you mean by doing the shadow work? You've used that a few times, and some people may not be familiar with that term. Can one of you just unpack that briefly, and then we'll give Laura the last word.
Yeah, just as quick as I can. In the Being book, I talked about that when my the stuff that I'd stuffed down for 20 years came out. Shadow is everything that's unaddressed, and people have said all throughout history, the unaddressed, the unassumed is unaddressed. If you have it. The guy that developed a process called focusing in the 70s said, what is unfelt is unchanged, but once it is felt, it changes. And so that's the key to it, is that therapists now are starting to say, what do you feel and where do you feel it? The sisters said something similar. They'd say, what is it you feel? I say, it feels like anger. Where do you feel that? And once you can be present with the parts of yourself that are wounded, then it's possible that those things can shift once they're addressed, right? So that's what I mean by shadow work. And in my book called Being, I kind of walk you through it. It even has a workbook with it. That process, but I'd encourage you to get professional help with it also. So that's what I mean.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, so for me, I'm going to kind of go back to what I said at the beginning of the podcast, and I think for me, the church of the future is not a building. It is. I think it starts with ourselves and being in touch with that knowing, being in touch with those parts of us, like Karl was just talking about, either with focusing or just sitting and listening to our own knowing, to our own spirit, and really asking ourselves the questions like, who am I? What do I believe, and why do I believe what I believe? 10 years ago, why do I believe what I believe? Because that's what everybody told me to believe. And to me, today, that's not a good enough reason to believe that. So I think it has to start from within. And I think once you have done some of the work like Karl's talked about, I think then we can take that out. And to me, that's a more authentic picture of the church, because like I said earlier, I'm just able to love more freely, to help more freely, to give more freely, because I know what my spirit is saying, and what it's saying is good, and to share that with people, not under the guise of you're going to go to hell if you don't believe this, or you live that lifestyle. So, I can love you, but I don't like your sin or whatever. Those things don't even matter to me anymore.
Mhm.
And I think that needs to be, just the church.
Amen. Well, my heart is warmed to see that you are thriving in the desert, and look forward to what's next. Thanks for this conversation. Appreciate
Thank
you.
you.
So from all the way up in Canada, thank you.
All right.
Appreciate your voice, and I know we'll keep in touch. So.
Yeah.
And thanks everyone for tuning in, tracking along today. And if you want to keep in touch with Karl and Laura, we'll put all their contact information and places you can connect and continue to track along with them in the show notes. So thanks again, guys, for being with me, and all the best in the desert. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, man.